Very welcome to you all. And thank you so much to Sergio and the Toronto Public Library for having us. I've been having a delightful time getting to share some of these scandalous tales from the city's past during this lecture series. I've already done love affairs and political intrigue, which I believe you can check out on the TPL YouTube page. We've got celebrity coming up next month. And for today, I thought the place we'd start was here, Toronto in the middle of the 1800s, which is kind of the beginning of the era I want to share some stories from today. Actually, already showed you some of these photos last month, if you were here for the political intrigues lecture, because these are actually some of the very first known photos from the whole history of Toronto, the very earliest set we have from 1856. And they give us this glimpse of Toronto in the 1850s. Here we're looking down King Street East. That's St. Lawrence Hall in the distance there on the right side of the street. It shows us this era when Toronto was a pretty rough and tumble place. Muddy streets and wooden sidewalks, but a place that was just about to reach a whole new level of growth. So the city had been founded here on this indigenous land at the end of the 1700s. It's about 60 years old as a settlement when these photos were taken, home to 30, 40,000 people. But over the course of the 1800s, in the late 1800s, it was going to boom from this kind of frontier-feeling town of 40,000 into a big, booming Victorian metropolis of 200,000 people. By the end of the 1800s, Toronto was going to be the second biggest city in Canada. It will have passed Halifax and Quebec City. Only Montreal was bigger. It now had streetcar lines and telegraph wires and extensive construction all the time. Its first skyscraper, the Temple Building, a whole 12 stories 12 stories high. No one had ever seen anything like it before. And this growth, this incredible expansion, well, it made some people in Toronto very rich. And not all of them in the most respectable and legal ways. It's an era when some of our biggest robber barons and tycoons got very rich in very scandalous fashion. So that's our topic for this month's lecture, Toronto's most scandalous tycoons and robber barons. And there are really 5 scandals in particular that I thought I'd tell you about today, though there are many more than that. You could do weeks and weeks of just lectures, I think, about tycoon and robber baron scandals. You can kind of get a hint of part of what was driving all that growth and a lot of those fortunes and some of those scandals as well by looking at this first set of photos. The photography team the city hired to take these shots at one point went up on a hotel roof. That's the view we get here, pointing in one direction. And they took sort of a whole sweeping 360 view from up there, including this shot of the waterfront that shows us this new technology that was going to change the city and launch a whole series of scandals, which is the train that you can see parked on one of the city's very first railroads. The construction had started just 5 years before these photos were taken. So this is brand new for Toronto at the time. This is actually the very first locomotive that ran on that very first railroad. It was named the Lady Elgin, this locomotive, in honor of the Governor General's wife, who had actually been the first person to dig up one clump of sod with a silver shovel at the ceremonial groundbreaking on this construction of what would become known as the Ontario, Simcoe, and Huron Railway, later known much more simply as the Northern Railway, which is the very first one in our city's history. It was built to sort of serve the same function as the old First Nations portage route, the Toronto Carrying Place Trail, to be a shortcut between the lower Great Lakes and the upper Great Lakes. So it started at Toronto, headed north toward Lake Simcoe, and then across to Georgian Bay to link up with the steamships on the upper Great Lakes, connecting Toronto to the heart of the continent through a port that was known at the time as Hen and Chickens, a delightful name that they very sadly got rid of and renamed the place Collingwood. So that's the very first railroad between here and Collingwood and the ships on Georgian Bay. And this railroad ended up sparking what I believe is our first really big railway scandal. Now, Victorian railway financing scandal doesn't sound maybe like the sexiest, most fascinating story in the city's history, but when you get into the details, it actually is, I think, deeply interesting. And it all revolves around the way that they financed it. They sold bonds, sort of stocks, to the public to finance the construction of the railroad, and they had a guaranteed rate of interest. So 6% return on your investment, which is a really good deal at the time that the construction started. But before long, these bonds actually weren't as good a deal as they had been when they first went out. And that's where the scandal begins, with the fact that the general interest rate at the time, by the time we get to the late 1850s, I think, is 7%. And these bonds are only 6%. So these bonds now are selling at a discount. They're only going for about 75% of their face value because they have this lower interest rate. And that discrepancy between the 6% and the 7%, between the 75% value and the full face value at 100%, that's what gives two notoriously corrupt business leaders and politicians their opening. The guy who came up with the idea was this fellow, John George Bowes, who was the mayor of Toronto at the time. He was himself a bit of a railway tycoon, a big champion for some of our early railroads. He helped get one built between, I believe, Toronto and Guelph. And he realized he could make himself a bit of money off that discrepancy in those railway bonds. And so he approached a colleague of his, Francis Hincks, who is the co-premier of what's now Ontario and Quebec, which were kind of mushed together in one giant province back then, the province of Canada. And Bowes approached Hincks with this idea that they could buy some of those cheaper railway bonds that were now just worth 75%. In fact, they do even better than that. They buy these bonds at 80% of their face value. So still buying them at a deep discount against their face value. And then they'd use their positions of privilege and power to run a little bit of a racket to make themselves even richer than they already were. This is Toronto's old city council chamber, what's now the Market Gallery inside St. Lawrence Market. They still have the mayor's old chair in there. And Bowes, as mayor of Toronto, was able to convince city council to pass a motion asking the province to back those bonds and to restore them to their full value. And Francis Hincks, since he was the co-premier, he was able to get the province, the provincial government in Quebec at the time, to do it. And so the government then invested in the bonds, making them worth their full 100% value. So the mayor and the premier had bought them at 80% and then managed to get the government to honor them at the full 100% value. Then they took them and sold them in England and managed to make thousands and thousands of pounds off the fact that they'd orchestrated all of this in this shady manner. All told, the profit they turned is said to have been a little over 8,000 pounds. But it became known in the press as the 10,000 pound job. They ended up rounding up a little bit. I think it's in part because there were some costs associated with it. And they actually sold them for 10,000 pounds more than they were worth, but only managed to pocket that 8,000 pounds. And it ended up becoming one of the biggest political scandals of the age. Absolutely front page stuff back then. And ended up sort of leading to the fall of these two political figures, at least for a little while. There was a big investigation at Toronto City Hall, the old City Hall that's now the St. Lawrence Market. Bose eventually resigned and was forced to pay back his half of the profits off the 10,000 pound job. And Francis Hincks, he would face repercussions at the provincial level too. There was an investigation into his part in the affair that actually would eventually end up deciding that he wasn't quite as guilty as his partner, and he was never forced to pay back his half of this scheme. But his government did end up falling as a result. He resigned, came back as non-premier in the House, but eventually ended up leaving, but got a softer landing than Bose did. He ended up being appointed governor of Barbados and eventually of Guyana as well. So still managed to carry on with a pretty respectable career. In fact, he was eventually, his reputation rehabilitated. After Confederation, when Canada became its own country, our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, asked Hincks to serve in his cabinet as finance minister. And so Hincks, even though he had been disgraced by the 10,000 pound job, ended up being able to resurrect his political career in Canada at pretty great heights, which is sort of a recurring theme about a lot of these scandals around tycoons and robber barons, is that they often manage to only face temporary repercussions. And it's often while working class people face sort of permanent exile and ostracization and even jail for their scandals, these more powerful figures tend to do all right in the end. And that was true of the old mayor as well. He ended up leaving city council, but ended up getting a job at the provincial level. He ended up being elected at that higher level. Certainly history that maybe has repeated itself once or twice. I imagine you can all think of another Toronto city councillor who might not be as beloved in the city as they once were, but has managed to do quite all right for themselves at the provincial level. And that's something that's been going on since at least the middle of the 1800s. In fact, Bose would eventually run for mayor again and ended up back in the mayor's seat about a decade after the 10,000 pound job went down. So that while they've both been tainted by this scandal, they both ended up only kind of suffering temporary repercussions and just ended up right back at the top level of politics just a few years after it all went down. The Northern Railway wasn't the only railway to have deeply scandalous figures as part of its founding story. That's true, too, of the Great Western Railway, which connected Toronto to Niagara through Hamilton, sort of around the Golden Horseshoe. And there are two figures of the Great Western who found themselves caught up in big scandals. One of them was this guy, Sir Allan MacNab, who is one of the giants of early Toronto history, one of the most powerful public figures and politicians in our city's history. He was one of the leading members of the Family Compact, the group of sort of Tory elites who ran the city and the province to their own benefit in the first half of the 1800s. He'd actually been caught up in a scandal long before the railway got built. MacNab had fought against the invading Americans during the War of 1812, and then again against Mackenzie's rebellion in the 1830s. And in the wake of that, Mackenzie, William Lyon Mackenzie, our first mayor, had tried to keep his rebellion going. As he tried to overthrow British rule and the family compact with it, he had taken over an island in the Niagara River, declared it to be the independent Republic of Canada, tried to keep this uprising going. MacNab ended up leading some Canadian militia and government supporters to the island, where they bombarded it for 10 days and even ended up sneaking across the border onto the American side of the Niagara River to attack this boat, the Caroline, which had been supplying the rebels on the island. They ended up seizing the boat after a gunfight, set it on fire, and left it to drift down the river. We think it actually sank before it reached the falls, but the press was filled with propaganda images like this. They even killed one American during the fighting, a guy named Amos Durfee, whose corpse was then strung up in Buffalo outside a tavern to help drum up more support for the rebellion. And this attack on this American ship and the death of that American guard ended up leading to a major international incident, all thanks in large part to Allan MacNab. It nearly plunged Canadians and the British into a war with the United States. And so MacNab's name was already one that had been surrounded by plenty of controversy. My favorite scandal about MacNab, though, comes right at the end of his life. He's well known in Hamilton in particular because he built his home there, Dundurn Castle, which is still a big historic site in Hamilton today. In fact, the publisher of my first couple of books, Dundurn, took their name, I believe, from Allan MacNab's old house. And it's where he would eventually pass away, which is when this scandal broke out. Because MacNab, as a leader of the family compact, was deeply Protestant. That was very much part of the founding vision for our city, that Toronto was going to be an incredibly Anglican, incredibly Protestant city. But Allan MacNab, with his final breaths, had converted to Catholicism. And this in a deeply anti-Catholic province. And so when he died, some people refused to believe it. It seems to have really happened. His wife was Catholic, and he was maybe worried as a religious man that he wouldn't get to spend eternity with her in the afterlife if he didn't convert, and so did right on his deathbed. There are records of his baptism having been carried out by a bishop there, but people refused to believe it because he was this sort of paragon of the Protestant family compact, which means that in the wake of MacNab's death, you had the Catholic and Protestant churches fighting over his immortal soul and his human remains for where and which afterlife he was going to spend eternity and in which graveyard he'd end up being buried, which for, again, Ontario in the mid-late 1800s was incredibly scandalous stuff. And MacNab probably wasn't even the most scandalous backer of the Great Western, because this is the contractor who built it. This is Samuel Zimmerman, who spent lots of time in our city, since it was the capital of the province on and off, though he actually lived in Niagara Falls. Some people call him the father of Niagara Falls. He's sort of in large part responsible for having turned it into the big tourist mecca that it remains today. And so it was really in his interest to get this railway built between Toronto and the city where he was going to make plenty more fortune by cashing in on all that tourism. And Samuel Zimmerman, he wasn't afraid to use a little underhanded politics while trying to land his contract to build it. He got all sorts of government contracts during this era, building all sorts of stuff on behalf of the provincial leaders, spent lots of time lobbying the politicians who would have been headquartered here at the old Parliament buildings on Front Street. So they were the ones built after the Americans burned down our first Parliament buildings during the War of 1812. They stood on the spot about where the CBC headquarters are today, Front Street and John. So kind of just right across the street from where the convention center is today, right by the CN Tower and the Sky Dome. This building was home to some of the biggest names in Canadian political history. It's where Baldwin and LaFontaine were fighting for responsible government and Canadian democracy. George Brown, Sir John A. Macdonald, all these future fathers of Confederation would have been there too. And it's where Samuel Zimmerman was trying to lobby a lot of them to give him these contracts. He's said to have actually kept an apartment, or more than one, in Toronto, not far from the provincial parliament buildings, so that he could wine and dine all our top politicians, throwing parties for them, receptions, all sorts of sort of backroom deals would have been hammered out at these social occasions that Zimmerman spent an absolute fortune throwing so that then he could get fortunes back in these government contracts. In fact, we know for sure that Francis Hincks, the old co-premier from the 10,000-pound job, was at some of these parties. In fact, when Hincks left in disgrace to go become the governor of the Barbados, Zimmerman threw him a huge party with 1,000-person-long guest list, tons of champagne, really sending him off in style. The kind of favor that might be repaid down the line when Hincks came back to Canada and served as finance minister. Though Zimmerman wouldn't get to enjoy those favors for much longer, because Zimmerman wasn't exactly known for the quality of his construction. So he ended up winning that contract to build the Great Western. It snaked its way around the Golden Horseshoe. It had its own big train station in the heart of Toronto. This is it. Stood on the spot where the O'Keefe Centre, which I guess became the Hummingbird Centre, the Sony Centre is now Meridian Hall, sort of that spot by the Esplanade, which used to be filled with railroad tracks, where it meets around the foot of Yonge Street, I guess, before the railroads joined together to make Union Station. And that railroad, well, it would connect our city with Niagara, which was of great benefit to the province and to Zimmerman too. It would link up with the big suspension bridge that the Great Western sort of helped build across the Niagara River into the United States, linking us up with American cities, which helped lots of people in Toronto make a lot of money, thanks to those new, quicker connections than we'd ever had before. But the Great Western wasn't built particularly well. As I say, Zimmerman was infamous for the shoddy construction work that his crews were responsible for. Even when the Great Western was about to open, when Zimmerman took dignitaries out on a test run, the train ended up derailing and fell off those rails. When he built a big, long railway bridge at Rice Lake near Peterborough, that bridge had collapsed too. And neither of those were the most infamous disaster associated with Zimmerman's railway construction. It was this one. This is the Desjardins Canal out by Hamilton. At the suspension bridge you can see up top, and that lower bridge there, that's the new railway bridge they built for the Great Western. And it wasn't too long before that railway bridge collapsed. This is an image of the Desjardins Canal disaster, which left part of the train plunging into the icy waters of the canal below. 59 people ended up dying in this disaster, in this derailment. Still one of the deadliest and most notorious railroad disasters in Canadian history. And on board the train that day was the man who built it. Samuel Zimmerman was on board when the canal claimed that train, and he was one of the 59 people who died that day. So that Samuel Zimmerman ended up getting killed by the poor construction work on the very same railway he had been responsible for building in the first place. And that is still not the most notorious railway scandal in Canadian history. That one revolves around the railroad built to connect the whole country. So I'm sure many of you are already well aware that one of the central promises of Confederation, of the deal to have these British Canadian colonies unite into its own country, was the idea that we were going to build a railroad from the East Coast to the West Coast. And that the central champion of that idea was the man who'd become our first prime minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, pictured here in a photo in Charlottetown, the first of the Confederation conferences. They say Macdonald is sitting down because he's too hungover to stand. During a week that was filled both with political meetings and also a lot of partying at night, while all the fathers of Confederation, nearly all of them, are said to have had plenty to drink that week, it's Macdonald who seems to have been too hungover to stand, at least according to the stories. He was not a charming social drinker. He was a deeply alcoholic, would actually end up setting himself on fire during the last Confederation conference in London, England, probably having fallen asleep at bed at night, reading the newspaper, having had a few drinks, letting a candle burn, fall over, set his sheets and his pillowcase and his curtains and even the pajamas he was wearing on fire. He was lucky to survive. And once he became prime minister, he was supposed to make good on this promise of building the railroad across the country. Now, he's someone who obviously whose legacy is being rethought a lot these days because of his prejudice policies he carried out during his time in office. But even the thing he is often celebrated for, one of the things, this construction of the railroad, he actually did in incredibly underhanded, corrupt, and scandalous fashion. Because this government contract to build the railroad from East Coast to West, this was going to make some railway tycoon incredibly wealthy. People were battling two big railway constructing companies in particular to land that government contract that was going to be incredibly lucrative. And one of the tycoons who was determined to get it was this guy, Hugh Allen. And he was so determined to be the one to win this contract that he was willing to spend a fortune to get it. Hugh Allen spent $350,000 or so. And this is in 1860s money. So far back that the Bank of Canada's inflation calculator doesn't even go anywhere near as far back as that. But even if it were $350,000 in the earliest date that the Bank of Canada inflation calculator will let you enter, which is 1914, that would be $10 million. So this must be tens and tens of millions of dollars back in the 1860s. An absolute fortune paid by the railway tycoon to Macdonald's government. And they needed that money because our very first dissolved parliament into a federal election was about to take place. We had an election to kick things off. This was now the first re-election bid in Canadian federal government history. And Macdonald's Conservatives weren't looking like they were necessarily going to run away with a landslide victory. So Macdonald ended up taking that $350,000 bribe from Hugh Allen and turned around and then used it to bribe voters to vote for his party, the Conservatives, in the next election. So kind of a double scandal. And it worked. the voters did repay MacDonald by giving him an election victory. This is in the days before the secret ballot. In fact, the reason we have a secret ballot today is in response to this scandal. We would have one in the next election after the news of this scandal broke. And since there wasn't a secret ballot, it meant that the people who bribed voters could then make sure they actually voted for them, sort of enabling bribing to take place. Today it would be a lot harder because you couldn't be convinced that anyone was voting for you for sure. And so MacDonald came back to power, thanks in part to the payments that had been paid to these voters, and in response did award the contract to build our railway to Hugh Allen. But there was a very long paper trail filled with evidence that this was all happening. Sort of the Victorian equivalent of scandalous emails that are in the news these days. There were scandalous letters laying out this whole bribing arrangement. Hugh Allen had them, and they could end a bunch of careers. So Hugh Allen was a little nervous about these letters as he headed off on a trip to London, England, to try to raise more money for the construction of this railroad, to get some more investors involved. And he wasn't traveling alone. Big influential politician John Abbott, a future prime minister himself, someone who had actually once signed an annexation manifesto asking the United States to take over Canada, something he would later admit was a youthful mistake at the very least. He was traveling with Hugh Allen during this trip to England. And Hugh Allen, knowing that he had these letters that would be incredibly damaging to everyone involved, letters between himself and MacDonald, one of MacDonald's cabinet ministers, Georges-Étienne Cartier, was actually the guy who saved his life when he was on fire that night in London, England, having doused the future prime minister with water and helped put out those flames. All these letters between these high-level politicians and the railway tycoon, Hugh Allen entrusted them to John Abbott, knowing that Abbott was trustworthy and wouldn't let them leak, but underestimating the other people involved a little. So Allen gave the letters to Abbott, but Abbott wasn't traveling alone. Abbott had his personal secretary with him, who, along with an accomplice, whose name I have yet to see recorded anywhere, ended up stealing those letters from John Abbott, knowing that they were political dynamite that could actually make them rich if they did what they did next, which was to take those letters they'd stolen from Abbott and turn around and sell them for quite a bit of money to the last people in the world that the Conservatives would want to have them, which was the Liberal Party under their leader, Alexander Mackenzie. And so, of course, the Liberals then allowed those letters to go public and sparked one of the biggest political scandals in Canadian history. It became known as the Pacific Scandal, since that railroad was being built to the Pacific, and it ended up becoming just an absolute firestorm of controversy. Political cartoons like this one that shows MacDonald standing on Canada's neck with a letter or a piece of paper in his hand about how he's using prorogation and suppression of the investigation to try to get away with it. His palm reads, "Send me another $10,000. It was enough that it seemed for a while like it might have ended MacDonald's political career. In the wake of the Pacific scandal, MacDonald tried to squirm out of it. He said, though, that he couldn't be sure that he hadn't done it because he was drinking so much, he couldn't remember everything he'd done. As I say, he wasn't just a charming social drinker. He was get drunk and throw up on a chair at the Governor General's residence level of an alcoholic. He would go on benders where he'd just disappear for days at a time. I think even weeks where he wasn't showing up to work. And so he couldn't promise that he hadn't been blackout drunk at some point and orchestrated one of the biggest bribery scandals in this country's history. And in the end, he couldn't avoid his fate, which was that he resigned as prime minister in disgrace. And the governor general ended up asking his opposition, the Liberals, to form a government instead. And that's when MacDonald spent a good chunk of time living in Toronto. He had an office right here on Toronto Street, which used to be one of the most beautiful streets in the whole city, right near Yonge and King Street. Some of these old buildings are still there today, though we've lost a few of them, including that beautiful post office right at the head of the street. Some of them, though, do survive. The building right on the left here, that would later become Letros's Tavern. In the basement was Toronto's very first drag bar, throwing Halloween parties in the middle of the 1900s. Right next door to it, this building with the columns here on the left, it would be the site of another wildly scandalous moment in Toronto history. In the early 2000s, this building was serving as the headquarters for Hollinger Inc., Conrad Black's company. It's where he was caught out back on a security camera, getting his driver to help him carry away evidence that he'd been ordered not to move as part of his trial for, I think, fraud and embezzlement or racketeering. And so Toronto Street is no stranger to scandal itself. MacDonald's law office was right at the back, sort of the far end of the street in this photo, tucked away down here. We can't quite see it in this picture. But it was there because MacDonald, one of his law firm's biggest clients, was in Toronto as well. And so MacDonald ended up moving and living here for a while after resigning in disgrace. He was still leader of the opposition, I believe, at the time, but not needed to be in Ottawa quite as much as when he was PM. He ended up living with his son for a while until his son ended up falling in love with an older Catholic woman, something MacDonald found so scandalous that he and his son had a falling out. He lived at the campus of the University of Toronto on St. George for a while too. His old house is still there on St. George. But he wouldn't need to be here forever because MacDonald would get incredibly lucky in the end. He had plenty of political organizers in our city trying to help him regain his post as prime minister. In fact, just around the corner, not a minute walk away from Toronto Street, is where they opened a new club in this building called the Albany Club. It's still there on King Street in what remains of this old building known as the Victoria Block today. The Albany Club was set up specifically to be a place for conservatives to hang out and chat, go to lectures, do a little drinking. It's still today around, as I say, and it's the only political club officially affiliated with a political party left in Canada. It's been an incredibly powerful force since the days of MacDonald. Like, I think every single conservative prime minister, all the way up until Stephen Harper, would be a member of the Albany Club. Plenty of premiers and mayors as well. The Albany Club would help MacDonald win votes in our city, and it wasn't long before he did come back to power. The Liberals were led by this guy, Alexander Mackenzie, who was himself a guy from working class roots, which was very rare for political figures of this level at the time. He had been a laborer when he was a young man. He had actually lost, I think, movement in one of his legs because of an accident when stone fell on it when he was, I think, a stone mason, but had risen all the way to prime minister. But while he was in power, the world was hit by a depression so great that before the Great Depression we think of as the Great Depression, this was the one known as the Great Depression, sparked by a stock market collapse in Vienna that spread across the rest of the world and ended up leading to this depression that Canadian voters blamed on the federal government, or at least for not being protected enough from it. And so MacDonald, running against Mackenzie next time around, managed to win re-election despite the Pacific scandal. he would now be prime minister for the rest of his life. They say from that point on, he was basically a political immortal, untouchable. And it was during this period that he brought in many of his most controversial and horrific policies. It's the era when the railroad was built across the country, deeply tied to the act of pushing indigenous people off their land out west, built by Chinese Canadian rail workers, largely, which was incredibly dangerous work. Thousands of them died doing it. And then as soon as they were done, MacDonald's government banned them from voting and instituted the Chinese head tax to try to help keep them from bringing their families over. Asian Canadians wouldn't be able to vote in our country until the 1940s. And it's the very same month, in fact, that the last spike in the railroad goes in, that the famous resistance leader, Louis Riel, was hanged for treason for resisting the Canadian government's expansion. It happened literally, I think, 9 days after the last spike went in that Louis Riel was hanged. Many of these policies that are the ones that now are leading people to rethink MacDonald and had him in that protective box in his statue outside Queen's Park for years. I think they now have a guard keeping watch over him to make sure that statue doesn't get pulled down. And it's the era when the residential school system is expanded across the prairies as well. And the railroads would help make a lot of people in Toronto, as I say, incredibly wealthy all through this period. But it wasn't just the railways either. I have one more scandal I want to tell you about today, and you can get a little hint of it in this photo. This is another one of those pictures from the very first set of photos ever taken of Toronto that we know about so far. And it's got a glimpse of another new technology in this photo that you'll find right down here. This is one of Toronto's very first street lights. There weren't very many of them at first. Toronto has never been a very sort of lavishly spending city. And so when we first got streetlights, the city would only agree to pay for 100 of them. And there were very strict limits on how close together they could be. They spread them out pretty far, and they actually didn't turn them on for a good chunk of the year. If it wasn't a cloudy night and there was a moon out, they wouldn't turn the streetlights on. They wanted to save the money. They figured moonlight had done well enough for generations. They just continue by moonlight when they could. But as the city expanded and the population boomed during the late 1800s, we started getting more and more streetlights. And eventually they started turning over to electric power, driven by a big steam plant, right where the Great Western Railway station had been, right where the O'Keefe Center, Meridian Hall, is today. And one of the men behind this steam-powered plant that had managed to get the city contract for electric streetlights, well, he would end up becoming so wealthy that it was in part this electricity empire that enabled him to build the biggest house anyone had ever built in Canadian history, Casa Loma. Up there on that hill where many of Toronto's wealthiest citizens have been building homes ever since sort of the late 1700s, with that spectacular view down over the city all the way down to the lake, that's where Casa Loma would be built too. I'm sure I don't need to tell you all about what an incredibly lavish home this was, but the stats are absolutely incredible. 98 rooms inside this place, 25 fireplaces, lots of new technologies like an elevator and a central vacuum system, shooting galleries and bowling alleys, an oven big enough to cook an ox, and then sprawling grounds around it too, gardens and stables and a hunting lodge, and the whole folly, this whole sort of pretend castle filled with expensive art and furniture, the kind of collections that British aristocracy had been collecting over generations and generations to fill their country estates. Casaloma had it all bought all at once. In fact, the owner hired the Simpsons department store to go shopping, sort of create that kind of collection instantaneously, all in the name of lavish lifestyle for this man, Sir Henry Pellet. Pellet's dad had been a big business figure in our city, one of the early bankers at our first big bank, the Bank of Upper Canada. He had inherited his dad's empire and then started expanding it from there, including getting into electricity at the perfect moment, managing to land that city contract. He was a big believer in that old vision of Toronto in the days of Toronto the Good, that it should be a very British, very Protestant, and very conservative place. He was head of the Queen's Own Rifles for much of his life and very proud to have been it, and managed to create this castle in part to live the British lifestyle that he so desired. And by the early 1900s, Pellet and some business partners were looking to expand that wealth. By this point, Pellet is one of the biggest business figures in the history of the country. He's on the boards of many, owns, in fact, I think 20-something companies, and is on the board of 100 more. They say he's one of just a handful of people who ran the entire Canadian economy. Some estimates suggest he was in charge of a quarter of it himself. And now he and his business partners had built this power plant on the Niagara River in order to harness the hydropower there, which they were going to sell to the city of Toronto to make even more money. This building's still there today. I think they just refurbished it in recent years. It's now an event venue. You can, I think, get married at the old Toronto powerhouse. But the fact that Pellet and his business partners were going to use it to enrich themselves by harnessing the power of that great river, that was incredibly controversial. By the end of the 1800s, people were getting sick of these tycoons and these robber barons and how much money they were making. And some people were starting to push back. At Toronto City Council, the movement was led by this man, William Hayden Hubbard, one of our earliest Black politicians, who even served as sort of acting mayor for a little while, which made him the first person of color to do that in Canadian Torontonian history. And at City Council, which by now was at Old City Hall, he started pushing for this idea that he and his allies called public power. The idea that the government should take over that power plant and use it not to enrich any private interests, but to give the people of Toronto power at a discounted price. And while Hubbard was arguing for that at the city level, Sir Adam Beck was doing it at Queen's Park, the provincial level. He was actually a conservative who still very much believed in these ideas, used a Latin phrase that said the gifts of nature were for the public, that Niagara Falls and the power it generated should be used to benefit the people as opposed to benefiting Sir Henry Pellet. And that's what ended up happening. The conservative provincial government took over that power plant, bought Pellet and his friends out, and used it to launch Ontario Hydro. So we'd have public power for decades to come. It would remain entirely public until the 1990s when another conservative premier, Mike Harris, started selling off chunks of it. And the city was so proud when it was first instituted that they even had a grand light switching ceremony at Old City Hall. You can see it here. They draped the building in electric lights, even had a huge mural of Niagara Falls erected above the front entrance. That black slit you see at the top of the falls there, that was actually so that they could pour water, real water, out of it as part of this opening ceremony. Now, lots of people have suggested that this is the moment that the fall of Sir Henry Pellet began. But in truth, it's not. He still had a ton of money. He'd been paid for his part in the power plant. And it wasn't until years after all of this went down that he began construction on his enormous mansion, Casaloma. Instead, the thing that brought Henry Pellet down was his own corruption. Henry Pellet was wildly corrupt and engaged in all sorts of shady business practices. One of them, for instance, was the way he ended up dealing with land. He would sell land he had bought from one of his companies to another one of his companies. He did it, for instance, with a bunch of land he bought around Bathurst and St. Clair, actually around the neighborhood where I live. You can see, you'll see Gates and Claxton Boulevard that he had erected before the whole thing went south. He ended up selling land basically from himself to himself, and he'd pay more than it was really worth, since he was just paying it to himself anyway. And then he could claim the land was worth more than it was in reality, and then use it as collateral, as his backing, to then borrow money based on that inflated value. And he was borrowing millions and millions of dollars based on these sort of fraudulent foundations. Lots of those millions from his friends from the Queen's Own Rifles, who ran the Home Bank of Canada. Its head office is in this photo on the right-hand side, the building with the columns there at King Street and Yonge. He ended up borrowing so much money that when they eventually asked him to pay it back, he couldn't. And the collateral he had, all of this land, for instance, this wasn't actually worth what he'd been claiming it was worth. So he couldn't just sell it to raise the money or hand it over to the bank, as he couldn't pay back these loans. And as a result, when the home bank asked Henry Pellet to pay them back and he couldn't, the whole Home Bank of Canada collapsed. One day, the customers who had put their money in that bank arrived to find the front door locked and a notice hammered into it saying the Home Bank of Canada basically didn't exist anymore. Thousands and thousands of people had lost their life savings, having entrusted it to this bank. Lots of them were Torontonian Catholics. The bank had originally been founded to be a place where Catholics in a deeply anti-Catholic city could invest and could save. Lots of them were farmers out west. It's one of the reasons, they say, that led to discontent between Western and Eastern Canada is because thousands of farmers who put their money in this bank lost their life savings overnight and blamed the politicians and the bankers of the East for allowing it to happen. There's a huge investigation afterward, a royal commission looking into all of this fraud. Henry Pellet was mentioned by name in it. The second time his shady business dealings were mentioned by name in a royal commission, a federal investigation. It's when we get the Bank of Canada and much stricter banking laws. It's part of why they say Canadian banks did better during the recession in 2008 than many in the world, is because of the strict laws we introduced after Henry Pellet brought down the home bank. It's part of even what's been in recent headlines with Trump trying to get Canadian politicians to loosen our banking laws and make it easier for American banks to deal here. And as for Henry Pellet, well, he could no longer afford now to live in his pretend castle. He couldn't afford to pay the staff or the heating bills or his municipal taxes either. And since he couldn't pay, the city kind of had no choice but to take the castle in lieu of those payments. Sir Henry Pellet was forced to move out. That lavish collection of art and furniture was auctioned off to the highest bidders, and Pellet would spend the rest of his years moving into one smaller home after another. As what was left of his money and goodwill dwindled, he would eventually pass away living in the home of his own former chauffeur in Etobicoke. And the castle, well, now that the city owned it, they weren't entirely sure what to do with it. For a while, it was run as a hotel, a jazz club. They eventually had the Kiwanis Club take it over, which is the era when Casa Loma first transformed into a public tourist attraction, and this monument to private wealth, which played a large role in one of the biggest financial scandals in our city's history, has now become sort of a monument to the public in Toronto. a place we get to explore and play in escape rooms and marvel at the amount of wealth that must have built it in the first place. So, thank you all so much for listening to those 5 scandalous stories. As Sergio mentioned earlier, we're doing it again next month. I think it's December 12th, another Friday at noon. We're going to talk about some of the biggest celebrity scandals in Toronto's history. And if you're interested in more of my work, my website's just adambunch.com. I've got my Toronto Time Traveler newsletter, as Sergio mentioned. And I think the next thing I'm going to do is a walking tour about some big Toronto spectacles from the past. Human flies climbing skyscrapers, giant elephants, maybe big fires, that kind of stuff, which I expect to do in a couple of weeks. So if you subscribe to the newsletter or keep checking my website or follow me on social media, you'll get details about all of the stuff that I'm up to. So thank you all so much again for having me. It's been an absolute delight.